Thank you. Up next, we have Jesse Sowell, who is going to talk about a top-down view of internet governance. I'm sorry, I'm very jet-lagged, so my words are not really coming well out of my mouth. But I see Jesse, he's here, and that will be way better.
So good afternoon.
Maybe you should sing a song.
Nobody wants to hear me sing a song.
Are you sure?
I'm positive. Oh, here we go. Awesome. So I'm going to be giving a presentation on top-down internet governance. So my primary research focuses on understanding how the bottom-up communities actually work. But today I'm going to be talking about top-down. So rather than I'm certainly not peddling the ITU position, I'm more of more looking at the idea of kind of a public service announcement from your friendly neighborhood policy wonk. So what are the key takeaways here? The first is that the international telecommunications regulations are being renegotiated as we speak. They will be formally renegotiated in December. The ITRs regulate traditional interconnection costs, read telecommunications, basically how various telecom operators decide who gets paid for originating and termination. Under the current ITRs, the internet is exempt. These were set up in 1988, back when the internet was just a toy research project. But more recently, the internet is cutting into international telecom revenue streams, and that draws the attention of state regulators. So the key proposals that I think are interesting to you are that route origin and identification are key proposals in the renegotiation of the ITRs, as well as regulation of peering arrangements. So think of RCEP in France and other efforts at saying, hey, we'd like to know how you are interconnecting and why you're interconnecting and understand your contractual relations. So the question that I am posing to the community as a bottom-up guy talking about top-down is, how can you convey the positive economic outcomes of the existing internet industry to regulators? The mechanisms that you use, the ways that you peer, the ways that you resolve problems, how can you convey those positive outcomes to regulators to convey to them that the internet is a nice, stable, happy place? And so and part of that is, how do you engage with top-down governance organizations? And so to get to that idea, to get to how do you engage with top-down governance organizations, we are going to talk about governance. And when I first gave this presentation, I mentioned it to someone, and when I said governance, their response was to hiss at me, literally. We are going to talk about the G word, and I'm going to convince you that it's not evil, it does not equal government, and that a lot of you are engaging in some of these behaviors already. You're already creating order. So being a good little academic, I would not be true to my nature if I didn't have some bookish definitions and some fun little academic definitions. While those definitions are pretty, they're not really the focus. The objective is to help frame the problem. And the problem is pretty simple to frame. Regulators are in the business of saying what you should be doing. Operators, you, are in the business of getting things done, in the business of how things work. So the discussion point is how to facilitate communication between the operator communities and regulators. So let's press into the fun definitions. So this is the internet governance definition provided by the Working Group on Internet Governance. This is something that was put together by the UN. And we're going to walk through some of this and kind of point out why it's a what instead of a how definition. So note the mention of respective roles. As a product of a primarily government-driven body, governments retain their privileged role. Note that capital G is not a typo. So what this doesn't really tell you is how all of these objectives are going to do. How is this development going to do? Who is going to do development? Lots of contention here over how. Another is that the idea of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and programs, this is all well and good. This all sounds nice. But what is not pointed out is that if we go back through history, building a regime of this nature, building a regime that fulfills these requirements is hard. It is not easy. History tells us that you need a strong hegemonic leader to enforce these norms, rules, decision-making, to engage in the monitoring and enforcement that really makes the regime work. And if you just look at this definition and some of the discussion around it, it's a kind of, if we build it, they will come. The final aspect is shaping the evolution, which I think is a extraordinarily ambitious goal. The idea that through the authority of a state, one can shape the evolution of the internet. This doesn't really get to the idea of how or what mechanisms are effective. This is derived from authority, not, as I would argue, discussing the bottom-up organizations, the experience that one gets from empirically doing this, from actually building these systems. So I'm going to make I'm going to propose to you that this is what, but we're not really talking about how. And I'm going to propose to you that some other academic definitions actually have some pragmatic use here. So the way I would look at governance is that governance is a means by which community affects its image of order. And you are that community. So I would argue that this community, the internet, the operator community, or the RIR community, or IXP communities, pick your favorite community, which we'll go into, has identified pragmatic mechanisms that are explicitly or implicitly adopted. And the point is that you create an image of order. It may not be as easily understood to government regulators as they would like, but within this community, through what I've seen, you seem to have a good handle on what the norms and objectives are. So that image of order is what has the community defined as its goals? What does the community value? Given that context, why are these effective? All of these are part of the bottom-up process of this means by which community affects its image of order. And this should really read images of order. There are a number of different communities, and they all have different images of order, but I'd argue that they all follow bottom-up consensus building process, which is very different and very foreign to some of the government regulators in the ITU. So unpacking means the idea is that you really want to avoid potential conflicts that threaten to undo the opportunities to realize mutual gains. So this is one way to describe very abstractly what I believe the operator communities do. It is informal, but they're well-known norms. Moreover, there is as we'll get into this more, there's a very distinct difference between the telecom metaphors, the ideas of circuit-based accounting rate systems, and how those are regulated from how the internet actually works now. There's also, when we think about eliminating potential conflict, there's a lot of discussion that we will be getting into about how disputes are resolved. So now that we've given a little bit of difference between what and how, we're going to dive into a little bit of who precisely it is that is vying for this governance role, or vying for these governance rules. So this is the constellation of many, many actors. We are here. This is more generally, these are the bottom-up organizations that many of us are familiar with. Many of us participate in every day, and we understand how these operate. In contrast, the ITU constellation comprises the UN and member states. The ITU's power, rather than being derived directly from the community, as it is here, power and legitimacy is delegated by the state, very much top-down. This is the basis of authority in this group, is the idea that states have legitimate monopoly on power and legitimate monopoly to regulate. So the question is, why do the folks in the UN and the ITU feel internet regulation is necessary? Why do they think they should have their fingers in this particular pot? the basis of a number of the arguments they make go back to the Millennium Development Goals. And as we go through this very brief history of where the ITU arguments come from, we'll see that there's a number of terminology issues, mainly dealing with policy jargon. So for instance, where we see capacity building, this often translates to what this community would call training and outreach. So all of these are standard things you would expect from the UN: peace, security, development, human rights, et cetera, et cetera. But notice that these goals were established in 2000, and a lot of these folks were like, hey, there's this internet thing out here, and it has like the potential to revolutionize how our world operates, how things move along. So a lot of these, if you unpack them, I've just highlighted a few, and I will stress that these are my interpretations, is that you see development and poverty eradication. You see information and communication technologies infrastructure will lead to better economic development, better quality of life, et cetera. We don't have to go through all of these. But the key point here is that you notice that these are the key issues. These are what states care about: economic development. And of course, the last point in the WSIS principles, the World Summit on Information Society principles, is that strengthening of the United Nations, which translates to the ITU, remains relevant. It still has a job to do. So refining these, we see that we get these, after taking those Millennium Goals, we refine them into the WSIS principles. These are multi-stakeholder development of a technology foundation, capacity building, et cetera. I will argue that, or I am arguing, that the bottom-up community is already doing a lot of this. It may not be as evident to governments because they don't necessarily directly architect it, they do not directly develop it, but there's a lot of this already going on. Capacity building, training and outreach. The RIRs do this, IXPs do this, this community, NANOG, does this. Local content, I mean, that's pretty much one of the fundamental definitions of an IXP. Media, we have CDNs, we have a lot of effort on that. And international regional cooperation. So after a bit of negotiation, these principles result in the Internet Governance Forum, the IGF. So again, the IGF, as mandated, is supposed to be a place for these for policy folks to get together. It's the idea is that that it follows the WSIS principles. It's lightweight, decentralized structure, transparent, democratic, multilateral. All those nice things. So the idea is that it's a very welcoming, open place. And if we look at the mandate, it also has a lot of the same things that you see in these communities: discussion of policy issues, fostering discourse, sharing information, interface between institutions, all those things that I would argue that, once again, a lot of this is done by the bottom-up community. The difference is that the IGF, as constructed by a legitimate body, namely the UN and the WGIG process, is policy wonk friendly. States believe that, this is a legitimate place for us to come and talk about these issues and talk about how we want to, say, regulate the internet, or what the implications of our policy can be. And I've had a number of folks describe to me that, the IGF is a great place for policy folks from their states to come and kind of spitball, throw out some ideas, see what's happening, see what's going on. But not everyone sees the IGF as a talking forum. A lot of people want to see something with a little more teeth, something that gives the power to regulate back to the states. But if we follow this argument that I've been making, that we have so much in common, we have so many common objectives, what's the big deal? Why are we so worried about the ITU? Why are we so worried about the renegotiations of the international telecommunications regulations? So let's go back to the ITU. It's a fairly old international governance organization. It's technically the oldest. It was originally the International Telegraph Union, if that says anything to you. It was the primary standards and coordination body until about the early 90s, when this pesky thing really took off, that internet took off. So what are the key issues? The organization is really broken up into the ITU-R, radio communications allocates radio spectrum and satellite orbits, which are near and dear to states. ITU-T, technical standards and telecom interconnection, and ITU-D, telecom access and ops for developing regions. And those last two things, the technical standards and operations for developing regions, are key elements of their arguments. So if we have so much in common, the real change, the real difference is the structural differences, the process engagement. Member states are the ultimate decision makers. States appoint delegations, so if you want to participate in the ITU, you have to pay a large dollar amount to become a sector member. You need to be a civil society member, or you need to be on a state delegation. But ultimately, even though they have a working group structure that is somewhat similar to working group structures we see here, you are beholden to stay within your delegation for the most part. Whenever I first started developing this presentation, I went and found a few folks that I knew that actually had participated in the ITU, and those folks were very quick to tell me a very key difference. If you don't toe the party line for your delegation, you may likely be sent home. And when I say sent home, your representative takes your passport and literally sends you home. There was a very interesting story told to me about a fellow who decided that he wanted to, crazy idea, to coordinate across the delegate parties for different states. This was a delegate that, in contrast to like just sticking with his member state, with his group, he was going to actually cooperate with the others to try to come up with a common idea. His member delegate took his passport, sent him home. He was not towing the party line. That is a very, very different structure than we see here. So the ITU ultimately facilitates telecom treaties, such as the ITRs. That's how they've presented themselves thus far. But at the moment, the ITU itself does not have regulatory power, but that may change. In a nutshell, what they do now is they deal with international telecommunications over any communication media, except for, as in bold at the bottom, Article 9 special arrangements. That's the get out of jail free card for the internet at the moment. Historically, this includes standards and cost structures. So instead of negotiating cost structures amongst industry actors, namely the companies that are engaging in the infrastructure development, what happens is that you have the two states get together and say, we're going to negotiate how much it costs to originate and terminate a circuit, and we're going to set a rate on that, and we're going to figure out how, in the case of a lot of developing states, how subsidies should be transitioned, and that's where we start to see some of the conflict occur. So the key drivers, what are the points of contention? As we've already gone over, economic is the big one, lost telecom revenue, as VoIP becomes more and more present, as our friend Skippy comes along and gets in the way of nice telecom revenue to developing states that benefit from the accounting rate system. We see that they're not too happy about that. That's a revenue stream that is going out of their pocket and, as they perceive, into the pocket of private interests. Political is another aspect. It's asserting political control, asserting ITU preeminence, and some of the additional key drivers about the renegotiations is that under some of the proposals that we're going to see shortly, the ITU will have a new role in standards, and that ranges from the ITU being just a friendly oversight for our friends at the IATF and IEEE and other standards organizations to actually completely subsuming those. There's a whole spectrum of proposals on the board right now. So we're going to step into how the top-down folks see bottom-up organizations. One particular example is from some of the discussion of this early discussion of the WGIG, and this is the perception of the top-down folks. They see that the community does operate bottom-up. There is a very wide range of forums, as we saw in the previous slides. But what is perceived is they're coordinating their activities through private forums, and there's a lot of loaded background. And when they say private forums, they mean not in the public eye, not available to democratic processes. This is very different than what the community would say about how open the community is and how available and how much the community welcomes folks to join and participate. And it also, the last point is bold, opportunities for what is missing is opportunities for the less powerful to be engaged in discussions of global governance issues, participate in the decision-making process, and to understand the consequences. Again, this is a very distinct view of how bottom-up works from folks that engage with the top-down. So the ITU also has a complementary perspective. Our friend Secretary General Touré has said we need updated ITRs because without them, we risk the collapse of the information communications and technology networks, which underpin all communications technologies, and including the internet. So I just wanted to make sure you guys were aware that it's about to collapse in any minute without these regulations. Thinking of recent regulatory failures in finance and banking, Toure is looking for a framework that will avoid any catastrophe because, you know, the way you guys operate now are very much like the risk-taking behaviors of finance and banking. Just, again, a little heads up. So enter the new proposals for the ITRs coming in December 2012. So these are the high level of the ITR proposals. These are the ones that I think are salient to you and you should be interested in. But why stick with these abstract kind of high level points? Let's get specific. Let's walk through some of these proposals. Revisiting the definitions, instead of just looking at transmission, emission, and reception of signs, signals, etc., we're now talking about processing. This captures not only level 2, 3, and 4, but it also captures level 7+. So anything that pretty much looks like a connection, session, a circuit, anything that might have identity and origin information behind it, that's going to be captured by this particular proposal. And these are not set in stone. These are proposals. They're being negotiated, but these are just examples of what's going on in the ITU. Whoops, that's not the right button. The International Telecommunications Service redefining this. Essentially, we highlight this nice little parenthetical, including internet traffic termination. This is the antidote to Article 9. This is basically internet traffic is telecommunications traffic, and among other things, modes of traffic are subject to termination rates. So basically, instead of you negotiating your peering arrangements and how you pay for things, states will come in and say, this is how we think you should pay us for the infrastructure that we're providing to get your bits from here to there. Fun stuff. ITRs on transit. Transit rate, a rate set by the point of transit in a third country, indirect relation. I actually couldn't figure out what this would possibly mean. It's unclear, but it's clearly an effort to say, if you're transiting through our country, we're going to try to get a little, I would interpret this as try to get a piece of the action. This is typical of the accounting rate system, given the redefinition of processing that we saw earlier where we include processing of data. We see that this would include an HTTP session. So this is essentially pay-per-click. Dispute resolution. This language is very WTO-like. This is straight out of your textbook for how to build your favorite dispute resolution mechanism in international trade. This could go a few directions. The language and comments imply WTO-style dispute resolution, but we already have dispute resolution. There's, like, for instance, the arbiters in RIPE. The ITRs and routing, origin identification. Services terminating parties shall have the responsibility of receiving identity information in order to identify the origin of the communication. So basically, anywhere you are, anytime you engage in communication, you have to provide this information. You have to ensure that this is clear and to the point. So not only can you identify, but you can also charge. So member states operating agencies shall have the right to know which international routes are used for carrying traffic. This goes directly to understanding peering. This goes directly to, if you're sending data from here to there, you have to let them know exactly what the routes are, so you are not possibly futzing around with them, say, shuttling them through a state that has lower costs and playing termination rate games that have been seen in traditional telecommunications. So whenever we read this, shall have the right to know, read sovereign inalienable right. International routes, imagine the implications for bookkeeping. There are some organizations that do keep extraordinarily good track of their routes and how things get from here to there, but most people don't, and it's a pretty onerous burden. And not to mention the implications for political speech and activism. You can imagine what some states would be interested in following these routes for. So misuse and authority, misuse, appropriation, treaty reads national law, transposing the national law. The idea of purposes for which they're assigned follows the mentality that these are traditional, specific assets. So how precise could the purposes for understanding what IP addresses are used for could be? That to me was a very interesting point of dissonance. And unassigned resources. This is actually a strong reaction to spam and fraud prevention, equitable distribution of resources. And so there are many, many, many more. About 16 pages of our ITR content has grown to 200 pages and growing of comments by states and arguments. So given this idea of how and why the ITU and other organizations are coming in to attempt to understand how they can govern, the question is, these are the motivated regulators peddling what they want, but the bottom-up organizations are the ones with the operational capacity to inform and provide the how. So my question to you for discussion in the next 7 minutes and 26 seconds is, how should feedback between these work? How can you, as the actors on the ground who know what the operational costs are, who know the economics better than a number of these state regulators, how can you convey to your particular state government that, you know, some of these proposals are a little out of whack? They are not necessarily going to work. How can you engage in a cooperative process to share the information necessary to come up with a middle ground? And that's it. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to field questions. Todd.
Todd Underwood, Google. So one of the questions that I assume is in a lot of people's minds is, how is this not just pandering to a bunch of people who shouldn't have the authority they have? Like, why should we play their game? Why can't we just repeatedly demonstrate that they're doing the wrong thing and they're trying to regulate it in the wrong way, and every time they try it's going to cause problems, and do what we're continuing to do that works well? And I know that sort of seems flippant, but it's a serious question. Like, my head just spins with the insanity that is most of the ITU, and I don't know why we should pander to them.
So I'll tell you what their answer will be, and I'll go ahead and venture to answer it the way I would answer it. And that is, go back to the very beginning of the presentation. These are states that feel that they have legitimate authority to do this. If you want to give it a very optimistic view, it is they feel like they are protecting their citizens. They feel like they are preserving the revenue streams that allow them to continue to serve their populace. Whether that, as you just said, in what you're calling flippant, I would not call flippant, but they're not doing it in the most efficacious way. They're doing it in the way that they understand how to do it now. Governments have a habit of reaching for the tools that they are most familiar with. And the mechanisms that are at play in these communities are very, very unfamiliar to them. The whole idea that these communities operate, that there is some degree of equitable distribution and fairness of resources, and that these communities actually create policy, that's an extraordinarily foreign concept to them.
Sure, but, and I'll sit down after this, but isn't there another model which just says, there will be a distribution of foolish regulation on the planet with respect to everything and with respect to the internet. And some places will have insanely ridiculous, counterproductive, dumb regulation for moral reasons or financial reasons, and some places will have a lot less. Our experience has been that the places that have a lot less do a lot better, that's just good for them, right? It's good for their development of internet, it's good for business in the society, it's good for the populace, it develops new applications. People are happier with that. And ultimately, why can't we just do that? Say, yeah, you want to restrict stuff? Go ahead. It's going to be stupid and expensive, and it's going to retard your growth. Look at your neighbors and figure it out, right? Turkey, look at your neighbors and figure it out.
I think you've answered the question. I mean, that's sure. Please.
If I could take 20 seconds to respond to that, just so everyone understands sort of the reference question. Right now, today, governments can make laws that affect people and organizations in their territory. We know that. Governments do that today. They don't do a lot of it with respect to the internet. There's not a lot of roadmap for them to work on, but some of them are more ambitious than others, and it's all over the globe. It's not restricted to any part, north, south, east, or west. Bad internet laws exist pretty much uniformly, but not very many of them. The way that the ITU works is it's a union that creates treaties, and those treaties are international governmental treaties. When a treaty is adopted, then every government passes laws to implement the recommendations of the treaty. So this is a little different, because instead of every government trying to figure out what part of the internet do I want to break with my own laws, they get in a room and collectively decide what part should we all break? And the expectation is that if they come to a decision, they'll all pass common laws to do this. So it's the power of individual governments working together to do it all at once. And the fact is that if they do come to conclusions, on things that should be done, then there will be enormous pressure for every country to pass laws that reflect those recommendations, because participation is an all or nothing game. If you want your spectrum and you want your satellite orbits, then you want to participate in the standards and follow the recommendations. So we sort of have the forcing function of a treaty organization multiplying what used to be individual government action. Does that help? Okay.
Sandy Murphy, Sparta. I think I'm going to say just exactly what John just said. It seems to me that one of your slides of the different recommendations said, and you will write into national law that
Yep.
you will do these things, and that's a scary power.
Yes, that's the standard process of treaty organizations. But as a treaty, there is the option to not sign. There's the option not to participate. And John makes a very valid point about radio spectrum and satellite orbits. And for some elements of various governments, satellite orbits are very salient, especially to defense purposes. So that's something that should be balanced. But I think the essence of what I'm trying to get at with this discussion is that economics do drive quite a lot of this. Economics is what's driving the reaction to Skype and other VoIP-like applications, and the reduction of revenue to certain states. That's a very driving motive. So how can my question to you, and my hope that what you might take away from this, is how can the community, in whatever mode you think is most effective, go to your state governments and say, you know what, we are already doing a lot of this. We're already doing this development process. We're already creating a fantastic economic engine for you that will vastly surpass any amount of revenues you're going to get from the accounting rate system. And so how can you, as a community, provide the information necessary to do that? How can you demonstrate the positive outcomes of what you're doing here? That's kind of my answer to all three of those. Is there has to be a level of cooperation. To pat you on the back, you've done a really great job at building this internet, and now you're being justly rewarded by states paying attention to you. So so the question is, how can we move this to the next step? Because the history of private arrangements, private governance arrangements like this, is that states eventually adopt the good of them. And so what I'm arguing here is share what good mechanisms you've identified, share what good ways of reducing information asymmetries and sharing information and developing economic engines you can with them so they can better benefit from it. That's it. And I think I'm out of time. So. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. There was I didn't see the question. Please go ahead.
This is Martins from AT&T. I was just curious, do you have a sense for the current leanings of the, say, U.S. and Canadian reps to the ITU?
From what I've seen of the comments to the proposals, U.S. and Canada are generally have cute little one-liners that say, this will not work, this is not necessary, et cetera, et cetera. So U.S., Canada, and a number of European states are generally opposed to most of the recommendations, but then you see other states pushing for other states such as Egypt and the Russian Confederation and Brazil and India, pushing for moving more of these regulatory powers into something like the UN or the ITU. And when these slides are posted, I'm also happy, if you email me, I'm happy to send you the references that I have for various articles and discussions.
Just a quick comment. There was actually, Karen O'Donoghue from the Internet Society. Vint Cerf and Sally Wentworth from ISOC actually testified before a congressional subcommittee on this topic last week. And so there's a lot of activity right now related to this. So now's a good time to get those comments out. And the second thing, which you alluded to, we've talked about it in the context of we can just ignore them. But the other thing is, if you think in the context of the developing world, I think there's a potential here for the segmentation of the internet, which I think is something that we really don't want to see happen. And so from a global perspective, if we believe in a global internet, I think this is something we need to engage in.
Now, my response to that is, what can this community do to help the developing states? Rather than having them have to run to the ITU and say, help us, what can the community do? I think I'm out of time, so I'm happy to take this offline.